started. We're going to have a little bit of celebration, a celebratory event. The George Mason and KAIST, especially George Mason's School of Public
Policy, Government, and International Affairs.
Policy, Government, and International Affairs. And us, the SAP, is having exchanging a memorandum of understanding, MOU, for future collaborations. We have to talk more about what kind of collaborations we're going to have. Probably at least we're going to have research collaborations, sending researchers there for a short-term period, take advantage of George Mason's strategic place in Washington, D.C., and then also its educational and research facilities. And also we may be able to host some people from George Mason. But in the future we may be able to explore more possibilities of student exchanges or other advanced possibilities. It takes steps. It's not going to take overnight, but we want to do it more than just signing paper. But we try to make it real. And in that sense, it's really a great pleasure to have Professor David M. Hart here. And I will give you a more detailed introduction of him, but because all of you are waiting for eating, and so we have to our business. So,
should I make a little response first? Official response. So I just want to say that I'm pleased to be here and very pleased to have this agreement between KAIST and George Mason. As Professor Park mentioned, we're located just across the river from Washington, D.C. And in fact, I think that Northern Virginia may have the largest Korean American community in the United States. So we have a lot of Korean Americans on our campus, but also many Korean students in our program. And if people have interest in working on a dissertation project, especially, I think, or other kind of research project where being in Washington would be helpful, I think that would be a great first step. And so very, very happy to be here.
So we have can we turn that off? It's like a real spotlight.
Yeah.
Okay. So
what do we need to do? Just show off.
show.
Make sure it's right side up. This is public policy.
By the way, this is copy, photocopy. The original is in the department. Okay, this is a luncheon seminar. Why don't you have luncheon? While you are eating, I will introduce Professor Hart in more detail. As I briefly mentioned, Professor Hart is Professor of Public Policy at George Mason University. Currently, he is acting Senior Associate Dean of School of Policy, Government, and International Affairs. It's number 2 positions in the school. And also Director of the Center for Science and Technology. And I don't know whether you have seen this article sent by Professor Hart about OSTP, and then towards the end he said about his experience at White House as a director of international. Assistant Director for Innovation Policy in OSTP, and so he has also extensive experience in the government as well. And And Professor Hart's main interest is in understanding how public policy influences scientific knowledge and technological innovation. And by setting developments in science and technology in their broader social, political, and economic context, he aims to provide insights to practitioners, scholars, and students about how to manage change for the greater benefit of society. I just copied from his official website, but it sounds like STP mission statement. It's very similarities. And Professor Hart taught for a decade at Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University before taking up his present position as a tenured professor in George Mason University's School of Policy, Government, and International Affairs. He's an award-winning teacher offering general courses on policymaking and political strategy, as well as specialized courses dealing with technological innovation, governance, and a global knowledge economy. These students have gone to influential positions in government, academia, industry, and non-profit sector. And his research focuses on how private and public sector actors craft policies together. He is currently working on major projects in the areas of high-skill migration, energy policy, and entrepreneurship. His work researches the policy community as well as scholars appearing in such venues as Nature, and, Science Journal, and Congressional Quarterly Press. And also he's working with journalists as well, and has been quoted in Wall Street Journal, Fortune, Science, and Boston Globe, among others. He has worked with an array of public and private organizations in the United States and abroad, including U.S. National Research Council, the Whitehead Institute for Medical Research, and National Natural Science Foundations of China and UK Treasury Department. And then I just happened to learn that he's also coming to see what's going on in George Mason Songdo campus. George Mason has its own branch in Songdo, and so he's taking a look at it. And so and beyond that, he has an extensive experience in many areas, and so that feel free to ask anything not only about the talk, but also about the career and then science policy in the United States, or the field as a scientific policy, and the relationship between STS and public policy. And that's anything that you may be interested in, he may have an answer or suggestions. And so I will pass my. So now please welcome our speaker.
So thank you. Having that introduction reminds me I need to revise my website. So I have to begin with a bit of an apology. Typically in a seminar like this, it would be good to present work in progress. But as you see, I'm presenting a finished paper, and the reason is that I don't have any work in progress because I'm just doing administration all the time right now. But I'm learning a lot about that, and I still try to keep up with what I can in terms of both the policy and the academic work in this field, and absolutely willing to talk about any of the issues that you might be interested in. Let me explain the title of the paper a little bit. So the title, the published title, has this subtitle, An Agent, Not a Mole, and I thought I would explain it. So the general title, I think, is easy to understand, but the concept here is taken from spy novels. So some of you may read spy novels. And agent, of course, is the person who works for your government, and they're the advocate for your interests. But the mole is the person who is placed inside for some outside entity. So during this Cold War, there was a lot of concern that the Russian Soviet Union had the moles inside our CIA. So here, the allusion here is that the science office is sometimes seen as a mole for the scientific community. That is, the question that might be debated is whether the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which I'll explain in some detail, represents the president to the rest of the world, or does he represent science to the president? And my argument is it's most important that not only does that office represent the president to the rest of the world, but it has to be perceived to be doing so. And if there's a perception that the OSTP is representing some outside interest in the White House, then that will guarantee that it doesn't have any influence at all, because the White House is all about the president's power and trying to get the president's goals achieved. And I think all the offices in the White House need to be organized around that basis. So that's the title of the paper. As Professor Park mentioned, I did have the good fortune to spend a year working for OSTP. This was in 2011, 2012, but so right before the last presidential election when President Obama was reelected. And my main area of work was advanced manufacturing. So if anybody has an interest in that topic, I can speak to what the United States is trying to do in that area. And I had also worked on this subject before just as an academic person in the Clinton administration. So I have some years of experience in thinking about it. And it was really fun to have a chance to work there. And now to have a chance to reflect a little bit on my experience and try to distill it both for the scholarly community, but I also think for people working in the office. So I did have a chance to present it over there in the last year, which was fun. I'm the science advisor. The reason I got into this is my former colleague from Harvard, John Holden, is the president's science advisor, so he arranged for me to work. So before I start, I want to spend some time just talking about the United States and OSTP and the White House. So some of you may know American politics in detail, but I'm guessing that many of you don't. So, and it is a kind of a confusing subject even for Americans, but I think even more so for non-Americans. So I'm going to set up the talk by just explaining a little bit about our system and how the White House fits into it. And the main theme of the talk is decentralization. There's a tendency, I don't know if it's true in Korea, I just came from China, I spent a week in China talking to colleagues there, and of course China's a very top-down model. So they assume that when the president says something, it actually means that that something is going to get done. But of course Americans know that if the president says something, what it means is that the president said something. And we have to wait and see what happens. So let me just explain how that works. So the main characteristic of American institutions is that they're fragmented. And they're fragmented in multiple ways. The first aspect I mentioned here is that the private sector is very strong relative to the public sector compared to many other countries. We have a separation between our state governments, that is the regional governments or provincial governments, and the federal government. And the U.S. Constitution says that there are some things that only state governments can do and the federal government is not allowed to do. So there's some tension between the state government and the federal government. I think for our purposes, the most important one is what I'm calling the horizontal fragmentation, the separation of powers between the Congress on the one hand and the President on the other hand. Those of you who follow American events will know that there has been a lot of conflict between the President and Congress, particularly since 2010. This happened to coincide with the period that I was working at the White House. So one of the main purposes of the White House is how do we get something done when Congress won't do anything? So that's just a feature of life. But it's extreme now, but it's been present ever since the U.S. was founded. We also have a lot of turnover in office, so we have fragmentation in a sense through time. So in fact, I heard that when the Bush administration left, the George W. Bush administration left, they scratched the desks and kind of messed up the office for the new people coming in. I don't know if that's true or not. But anyway, there's not very many people carry on from one administration to the other, so there's some fragmentation that way. And then even beyond all these official aspects of it, we also have just many agencies that do and don't get along. Like every government, I think, has agency conflicts, but they can be frustrating to deal with because they're connected up to these other fragmented institutions. So this is the basic picture of our system. Yeah, so this more or less says the same thing, so let me skip over that. I just did want to illustrate a little bit when I talk about the wide variety of agencies. This is a picture of U.S. research and development spending, and you can see it's dominated by the Defense Department, which is itself, of course, subdivided into many agencies itself. But it's also divided into lots of other pieces. So we have the National Institutes of Health, where Professor Park worked for a number of years. Department of Energy, NASA, the Space Agency, National Science Foundation, Agriculture, Commerce, and so on. So lots of different agencies. And this budget is put together in an almost completely bottom-up manner. There isn't really a central entity that creates an R&D budget and comes up with some kind of a target for it, but rather it all comes from the bottom up. So now let me turn and talk about the White House a little bit. So we may think of the White House as a building, and it is a building. It's an important building. It's exciting to be inside it. But when we talk about the White House, it's really an organization. And not everybody who works for that organization works in the building because there's just too many people to fit. So there's around, last I heard, around 2,500 people that work for the White House. The official name of it is Executive Office of the President. And that contains a number of specialized offices within it, and so that's what I want to explain. So now I start to get towards the real subject of the talk, which is the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And it's important to understand it in the broader context of the White House organization. So the most powerful entity in the White House is Office of Management and Budget. It's about around half of the staff. So it's responsible for looking at every agency in the executive branch, examining its budget, examining its management practices. And one thing that's unusual about it is it does tend to have people who are civil servants working for it. So whereas almost all the rest of the White House will turn over when the administration goes out and a new president comes in, the OMB tends to stay. And so it is the sort of institutional memory for the White House to the extent that there is such a thing. And when OSTP wants to have an influence on the budget, it will collaborate with the Office of Management and Budget. So every year, the OSTP director and the OMB director put together a memo that says what are the administration's priorities for the coming year in science and technology policy. And then that goes out to the agencies, and the agencies then know what is going to be favored and what is going to be unfavored in the budget process. So the head of this office is one of the most powerful people in the White House. The other group of powerful people are in this category. So the chief of staff obviously is the person who oversees everything, is responsible for setting the president's priorities and keeping them on schedule and so on. And then usually in most White Houses, including the Obama White House, there are 3 policy councils that are the main policy development entities. There's the National Security Council, is the best known, so it deals with foreign policy, with military policy. I worked in the manufacturing area very closely with the National Economic Council, so that's headed by the economic advisor to the president, and deals with economic issues. And then the Domestic Policy Council deals with social welfare issues. It's dealing with immigration in the current administration. And so those 3, most White Houses, it's up to the president. He can decide how to organize the White House however he would like. But in most administrations, there are 3 policy councils. And the heads of those councils, plus the chief of staff, plus the budget director, tend to be the most important people in the White House. And in previous work on OSTP, I made the argument that for the science advisor to really get things done, he needs to work with those more powerful figures. And that's a little bit controversial because there are people, especially in the scientific community, who think the science advisor should simply be able to go to the president whenever he wants and ask for particular things in science policy. And I think the key factor here is that we should see science and technology not as ends in themselves, but they're means of getting things done. They're means of improving the economy, they're means of improving the environment, they're means of improving quality of life. And those are the goals of these policy councils. You're working as a way to get something done in conjunction with other kinds of ways of getting things done. So that was the big message of my prior work on OSTP. Then we have a number of specialized offices, and that's where I would put the OSTP. There's also a Council of Economic Advisors, which brings people from the universities who are economists to work on economic policy, sort of plays a similar role. There's a Council on Environmental Quality. So there are specialized offices in particular policy areas. Then we have offices that are mainly dealing with political issues. They have constituencies that they have to worry about either in the rest of the government, like legislative affairs, that's the branch that deals with Congress. But there's communications, which deals with the media. There are offices for women. There are offices for minority groups. So dealing with all the political constituencies. And then finally, we have some unusual offices. The president's wife is called the First Lady. She has some policy interests. Of course, when Hillary Clinton was the First Lady, she had much more influence than more recent first ladies. But Mrs. Obama is interested in childhood nutrition, among other things, and so she has some policy interests, and the vice president as well, depending on the administration. The current vice president mostly deals with foreign policy. But under President Clinton, we had Al Gore as the vice president. He was very interested in environment and science and technology, so it took a big role in the administration. So that's the big picture of the White House. So now we can go down one more level when we talk about OSTP. So OSTP has, when I was working there, about 100 people, various kinds. Not very many are actually paid for by the government. So, for instance, by the White House, a lot of people are working there, work for other agencies, so they're sent over for a year or 2 years to work at the White House. In my case, I was, Ginny, didn't even see you before. I was working for the university, so the university continued to pay me. So there are a wide variety of kinds of people working there. As I mentioned, the director of the OSTP has various titles. Informally, he's called the science advisor. Officially, he's both the director of the office and he's an assistant to the president, so he has 2 official titles, which there are some complications which I can explain if anyone's interested about that. And then the office officially is organized into 4 divisions: science, technology, environment and energy, and international affairs and national security. So each one of these has an associate director, and that's the second layer of hierarchy within it. And then under the president, the current president, they set up something called the chief technology officer. And this is also kind of confusing because he has the same rank, assistant to the president, as his boss does. So that's kind of crazy. But nonetheless, they're sort of making that work. And when I was there, the head of this office, well, the CTO was the head of the technology division. Now they've created a new office, so now there seem to be 5 offices there. So all this can change with each president, in fact, probably with each science advisor. Here's the budget of the office. This actually doesn't reflect its resources because, as I mentioned, they get a lot of resources from other places. But it gives you some feel for how the presidents have looked at science advising. This top line, the top line here is in real, current dollars, so not inflation adjusted, and the bottom line is inflation adjusted. So we had a big inflation in the late 1970s, and that's what brought down the budget. But you can see the real boost came with the first President Bush, and he was a heavy relier, relied heavily on this office, and then it's been more or less level since then. And I think what's marked the current OSTP is that it's creativity in finding resources from other places like me, and from across various federal agencies to work there. All right, so let me now talk about 2 other components, which are, when I will talk about OSTP, I'll lump them all together, but just to go through some additional pieces. The National Science and Technology Council, its function is to bring people from different agencies together to work on a common problem. So again, when I worked on advanced manufacturing, I was the organizer of an STC working group. So there would be somebody from Defense Department, somebody from the Energy Department, somebody from Transportation Department, and the OSTP is the chair of that group. And its main job is to try to get the agencies to work together on some issue. And then there's also the Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, which is an outside body. So this will be university presidents, venture capitalists, company heads, and it's so these guys have other jobs, and they come, I think, once every 2 months to Washington, and they meet. They issue reports on whatever the science advisor wants them to. So, so the science advisor is the co-chair of this. I think that's all I have on the structure. I know it's a little bit abstract, maybe a little bit boring, but I want to make sure people have the organizational context. Let me just stop and see if there are questions about this stuff. Yeah.
A couple questions. On the divisions, the science, technology, environment, and international security,
yeah.
Who would be the kind of person staffing, like leading those? Or?
Yeah, so, well, the leader is up to the science advisor or to the president to decide.
Like science versus tech, I'm just wondering. Like,
yeah,
engineers versus...
It would be, the tech division is Well, when I was there was a guy named Anish Chopra who was the head. He had been basically the head of the technology department in the state of Virginia, and he was a proponent of open innovation and open data. So his main thing was getting government data sets opened up for third-party use, and just generally working on opening up more transparency, I guess I would say that was his. Now that's a little bit unusual. That was his thing. The current head of the technology division is the guy that I worked for at the time. He's more interested in technology and economic growth, but he doesn't come from a technical background. The head of the science division is typically somebody from one of the universities whose main interest is academic research. National security will typically come from one of those agencies or one of the energy department laboratories, one of the labs. So it's heavily shaped by Los Alamos for whatever reason. When I was there, a lot of people from Los Alamos working there. So it varies a little bit across the divisions.
You show the graph that OSTP's budget is fluctuating.
Yeah.
And
What's going wrong there?
is it because Congress is not cooperating, or
It can be, yeah.
or the White House decided not to hire somebody?
It could be both, but I can tell you what happened most recently. This is a kind of a crazy story, so a sad story actually. So I haven't even gone into the congressional side of our government, which is equally fragmented and even more difficult for me to understand. But there are 12 appropriations committees, 12 committees of the Congress that are responsible for the budget, and OSTP is within one of these. And the chairman of the one that OSTP reports to is very concerned about religious freedom in China. Now, eventually, I'll tell you, these things come together. Anyway, but this is the way our system works, for better or worse. And not only that, he represented George Mason. His name is Frank Wolf, so he's from Northern Virginia. And so he's concerned about religious freedom in China, and he's trying to find ways to get the U.S. government to advocate for that, or to actually, in this case, to punish China for what he perceived to be its discrimination against religious minorities. So what he was able to achieve in the budget process right before I started working in 2011 was to put, we call it a rider, basically a provision which has nothing to do with the budget into this budget bill. And it said OSTP is not allowed to talk to anybody from China, basically, which doesn't make a lot of sense for science and technology policy in the modern world. Also NASA. You got both NASA and OSTP in there. And Dr. Holdren, John Holdren, the science advisor, was really angry about this, number one, and he has very strong connections with China, and he's very interested in climate change and energy development, and we need collaboration with China to succeed in those areas. So, and this is now, I'm going to waste all my time on this, but anyway. So now we get into this fact that we have these two titles. Director of OSTP. As a director of OSTP, the science advisor has to go through congressional confirmation, so he gets voted on by the Congress. And from that point of view, he reports to the Congress. But as an assistant to the president, he reports to the president. So he made this distinction. He said, well, I'm going to go talk to the Chinese, but only in my role as assistant to the president, and not in my role as director of OSTP. Well, this didn't make Mr. Wolf very happy. And so to get even, he cut the budget by a third. So that's, and then while I was there was all this back and forth about how do we get it back, because it was completely arbitrary. And they worked out some kind of a deal that now people from OSTP can talk to the Chinese, but they have to give a month's notice to the Congress, and I don't know, there's some procedure involved. And in fact, I mentioned I was in Beijing, and they were trying to get some OSTP people to participate, and this was a block for that. So that's, yeah. Mostly it's pretty level. So this stuff over here, and then of course our U.S. overall budget is going up and down like crazy for various macroeconomic reasons, and that affects that.
Sort of a cultural influence of science.
You could say, but I guess I tend to think of it as being a little bit, depending on the individual who happens to have a particular job. Yeah.
I wonder that does the OSTP funding correspond to the federal R&D budget or?
Not real closely. Not real
Then
closely.
what does it mean, the budget fluctuation of the risk budget? So, yeah.
So I think it has just more to do with the president's interest in this subject and the effectiveness of the science advisor.
If the government, maintain their interest in science and technology, but cut the budget of OSTP, and what does it mean?
I think it means that I wouldn't take it as a general message. It's more, directed to the individuals.
Administration. Very.
I think this period here is meaningful because it suggests that President Bush was really interested in building up his expertise in this area, and then they maintained it through this period.
But I think she's wondering, does it also imply that Reagan was not? Because it looks like, just looking at it, it looks like a drop.
I think it does, yeah. But of course, also Reagan was interested in shrinking the size of the White House overall, so you would also need to look at the bigger picture of the White House. But then also, so this inflation is a big deal too. You know, in constant dollars, this change isn't a huge amount. And the whole government was adapting to inflation at that time as well. So, I have my own views about President Reagan, and I think he was not very effective in the science and technology area. But I'm not positive that's reflected here.
Hi, I might have missed it, but then what does OSTP funding actually mean? Because I'm looking at it and it's like $5 million, so it's not exactly funding for R&D, but just personnel.
No, just for the office. Just so I mentioned there are about 100 people working there,
right.
But this funds, I think, around 35 or 40 people. It's
Okay,
almost
so
all
it just
personnel.
means if you're more staff, then it means you're being more supported by the president.
You have more capability to do the policy work that we're doing. All right, so let me turn to the paper now. So what I wanted to do then, after I left OSTP, was think about, how should we judge the office? So there was a lot of talk about evaluation, a little bit of an evaluation craze, policy evaluation, and that can be a good thing, but there are a lot of things in policy that are very difficult to evaluate, and this is one of them. So I tried to reflect on that, and I'm going to talk mostly about what I think are good ideas for evaluating this office. Although, even with these criteria, it's going to be a lot of judgment. You would have to have a lot more detailed information, and in fact, there's some information that's never written down between the president and the science advisor, for instance, if you wanted to do a full evaluation. But I think even so, even if we can't do a perfect evaluation, we can use these criteria to think about the job. And also, I think the science advisor can use these to think about what are the important things for him or her to be doing. So the history of the office, just to set it up, this is President Eisenhower. He was perceived to be kind of out of touch, and many of you, I'm sure, know that Sputnik was a big surprise to the U.S., to the public, not so much to the government. Actually, the government knew what was going on. President Hart probably knows this history better than me. So this is Sputnik here, and so there was a shock to the public. The Soviet Union is ahead of the United States. What does it mean? Does it mean we're falling behind in the Cold War? We're going to lose the Cold War? And so one of the responses to Sputnik was to set up OSTP to provide a message to the public that said, we have science advice, we have access to the latest information, and we're not going to be caught by surprise in the future. So actually the first holder of the office was Jim Killian. He was the president of MIT, but actually he didn't even have a PhD and was not a scientist or engineer. So his great talent was sort of organizing people. Most of the people that have held the office have been hard scientists, so either physicists or chemists. Many of them have been from the academic sector, and I mentioned I worked for John Holdren. John was the founder of an energy resources program at Berkeley. He worked there for, I think, about 25 years. Then he moved to Harvard and sort of developed the science and technology policy part of the Kennedy School of Government, which is where I worked before George Mason. So these are the people that work there. One piece of the history that I should mention is that it went out of business for 3 years under Nixon. So different presidents have different views of science and different comfort levels with, well, not just scientists, but any academic expert or any expert. So some of them are more comfortable with experts, and some of them are uncomfortable with experts. So John F. Kennedy famously was very comfortable. He came from Cambridge, had spent a lot of time around people from Harvard and MIT, and his OSTP was filled with people from Cambridge. President Johnson was from Texas, had more of a tough background, and was less comfortable with his advisors. And then in his period, of course, we had the Vietnam War, and protest against the Vietnam War was centered on college campuses. So he just saw scientists as sort of representatives of universities and therefore potentially opponents of him. And then Nixon went even further, and he had a kind of a war with the intellectual class of America. And during the beginning of the second term in 1973, he just said, "I don't need these advisors. I'm going to get rid of it altogether." So that continued while he stepped down. So he was forced out of office, and his successor, President Ford, then reestablished this office. And it was at that time that it became established under law. So it had previously just been established by the president as an executive action. Now, in 1976, it was established under law. So no president can get rid of it. Of course, he can ignore it, underfund it. There's no reason that he has to listen to it, but it can't be abolished except by congressional action now. So let me talk a little bit about criteria that I don't think we should use. So I don't think we should judge the office by how many people work for it or how big its budget is. We've already talked probably more about that than we need to. A lot of people also would want to judge it by the health of the national R&D enterprise. So, and this is particularly true for people from the scientific community. So their main concern is how well funded is science, and they want to judge OSTP on that basis. And I just think that's silly for a number of reasons. In part, if we just take it at face value that everybody's doing a great job, and that's not a very good criterion if it doesn't distinguish. But I think more importantly, what is the R&D being used for, right? That's really what policy is about. It is in part about how much, but it's more importantly about what goals does it achieve? As I was saying earlier, we should think about science and technology, and we should think about R&D as means, not ends. And so the purpose of the office is to achieve ends, and specifically, as I'll say, I think to achieve the president's ends. So we shouldn't evaluate it in terms of a budget. And this is all of, well, we have all three sectors represented here. So this is the combined private and public. This is the private sector, and this is the public sector. You can see the public sector not as continuously upward. And so there has been criticism of the science advisor in the past for not doing enough for the federal R&D budget. But again, I think that's not the right measure to judge this office on. But it's very hard for the science advisor to resist going out there and bragging about the science budget. So every year when the president's budget is released, the science advisor has to make a statement, appear before Congress, and appear before the press and say, look, here's our R&D budget for the year. And of course, when it's going up, he can be happy and take credit. And so to some extent, he brings this criticism on himself. And I'm not sure there's a way around it, but I would say, especially to people who are scientists, we shouldn't focus too much on this criterion. Another reason, this is now, this is R&D as a share of the federal budget. Okay, so what percentage of the federal budget is spent on R&D? And the striking thing is that this is completely flat for the last 30 years. Why is it? Well, that's not so clear. But what it says is, the science advisor really doesn't have much influence. In fact, nobody has much influence on the total share of the budget that goes to R&D. That has to do with the macroeconomy, it has to do with the agencies, and it doesn't have a whole lot to do with anything going on in the White House. So this is kind of an interesting observation. I'm not sure anybody's fully explained it. But I would say, again, this is sort of out of the control of the science advisor in OSTP. All right, so what should he do? So I think one of the most important things that the science advisor in OSTP can do is to stop bad ideas. one of the things agencies are good at coming up with is bad ideas. That's kind of, they come up with good ideas, they come up with bad ideas, they came up with any idea that will advance their mission. And somebody in the center of the government has to sort them out. And usually the agencies have a lot of technical expertise, and the White House doesn't. And so OSTP is the part of the White House that does. And it may have it internally, but more importantly, it has access to expertise, communities that can judge these things. And so its job is to tell the president, this may sound like a great idea, but it's really a stupid idea. And here's why. So I have a few examples here. Most of these are historical examples because we have more detail on them. So people like Professor Park have had a chance to dig into the archives and really explore them. The more recent cases are a lot harder to get data on. So this is the nuclear-powered bomber. Anybody want to have a nuclear-powered plane fly over their house? Probably not. Not a very good idea. It did stay in development for 15 years and absorbed $7 billion. So it was a viable concept from the military perspective. And finally, OSTP managed to shoot down, although not literally, just I won't go through all these, just a couple of other examples. This is the supersonic transport. You may know about the Concorde, which I think is completely out of service now. It was built by Britain and France as a supersonic passenger plane. The U.S. Discussed building such a plane in the 1960s, and in fact, the president was in favor of it, and the science advisor was opposed to it. And so that's why I say sometimes the science advisor might be opposed, but the president will still go ahead. And the reason this was never built was that the Congress wound up blocking it. And in fact, some people who had been working with the Office of Science and Technology Policy went public with their opposition, which is another reason why Richard Nixon shut down the office, because I think the last thing a president wants is a science advisor coming out, or some people associated with the science advisor coming out and saying, hey, I'm against your program. And I think that was probably a mistake. Another one I'll just mention, this is the Apollo program, the mission to the moon. Actually, the science advisor opposed this one as well. And so when we're thinking about bad ideas, of course, that is a judgment, right? That's a value-laden word. My own view is I don't like the manned space program either. People are very passionate about this, so I know I court some controversy in saying that. So some audiences, we have people who just love space and they want to go to space and so on. But I personally think it's not a very effective use of public money, very, very expensive. I'm all in favor of sending robots up in space. Anyway, so it's a mixed record, and of course, sometimes you succeed and sometimes you fail. And that's fine. That's the nature of working in the White House. You're going to have some wins and some losses. But the criterion is, did they try? Did they try to judge these ideas coming out of the agencies and evaluate them? And I think, again, a unique role because of the expertise that's available to this office that's not available to the economic office, the political office, and so on and so forth. Another concept which is similar, but kind of in the other direction, so that is shooting down bad ideas. This is about identifying good ideas or important ideas. So this is the idea that because of the science, OSTP's access to the technical community, it may be able to spot both opportunities and threats earlier than other offices. So this is from 1965, a report of the President's Science Advisory Commission, and it's talking about the greenhouse effect. So this was theorized actually in the early part of the 20th century, but the data on carbon dioxide concentrations was first collected in about 1957. So you've probably seen the Keeling curve, which is data collected in Hawaii. So by 1965, they had a trend, and it showed this upward trend. And actually, they did a pretty good job projecting what the levels would be in 2000. So while this didn't lead to a lot of action, it was the kind of thing I think that this office should be doing, looking over the horizon to the extent that people can see that, and coming up with important issues that the president needs to be aware of, and hopefully in some cases respond to it. So that process of putting together a response, called policy entrepreneurship. So this is the task of putting together coalitions, putting together ideas that are persuasive. Probably the most famous success that a science advisor had was in the nuclear test ban treaty in the early days of the Cold War. So the idea that you could detect a nuclear test from far away, from another continent, was not widely accepted. And in fact, some of the devices to do that were not even developed when this idea was first put forward. And there was a long battle between the various military and nuclear weapons advocates on the one hand, and the arms control people on the other hand. And in this case, they didn't get a full nuclear test ban, but they did get a limited nuclear test ban treaty passed under President Kennedy. Second example, this was less successful, but I think at least well-intentioned. This is under President Clinton to try to develop an automobile that would be both environmentally sound and economically successful. So this was called the Partnership for a New Generation of Vehicles, and the person that worked on it was Jack Gibbons, the science advisor, and he worked very closely with Al Gore, who was the vice president during this program. And I would say the advanced manufacturing stuff that I worked on also had some of this character, and I can talk about that if people want. So this is the second criterion. So we have shooting down bad ideas, a combination of early warning and policy entrepreneurship, so those are connected. That's the second one. And then third, I think advising in the case of crisis. This is Fukushima. The president was fortunate that he had advisors who actually knew a lot about this subject at the time. And of course, in a crisis, it's always the case that there's going to be bad information, there's going to be incomplete information, and you need people who can filter that information. And that means there has to be some level of trust between the science advisor and the president to be able to take action on incomplete information. And I think, from what I know of this case, and again, we probably have to wait a few years. I have a student who's working on Fukushima, but I think still we'll probably have to wait a few years for information to be available. But from what I know, I think this was a good example. Now, of course, this was in Japan, not in the United States, and it wasn't the kind of crisis for the U.S. that it was for Japan. But there was this trust, I think, built up between the science advisor and the president before this crisis, and the OSTP was able to be effective in directing the government's response. And in doing this, the science advisor has the sort of reservoir of confidence of the American public to draw on. So the American public is basically favorable towards the science community. So this is a poll, I think it's still taken every other year, though some of the data seem to be lagging, and it asks members of the public, how much confidence do you have in all these different institutions? So you can see Congress is way down here at the bottom. In fact, we like to say, when you get this low, you have to buy every point. So it's very hard to get lower. Of course, the media is just a little bit lower here. So, and the executive branches comes in a little bit more in the middle, but the scientific community and medicine are way up here. So that gives the, and in fact, I think this helps to explain why President Eisenhower wanted to have a science advisor to begin with, right? Because he can say, okay, I'm drawing on this trust that the public has in science. And I think in this crisis situation, this is also a very valuable resource for the president to draw on. I do want to point out, though, this doesn't vary very much. It pretty much stays stable. So this is a different kind of question, but it's the same idea. Do you think that the benefits of science and technology are greater than the harms? And about 70 to 80% of the people since the late 1970s when this was first asked say so. Similarly, do you think the government should fund basic scientific research? Again, very strong support. So this seems to be sort of a permanent reservoir of support that can be drawn upon. So we shouldn't judge the office on whether people are confident in science or not, but more on whether that person who's running the office and the office itself has the trust of the president to be able to bring that confidence to his needs. And then the last one, this is the most boring one, but I think probably the one that OSTP spends the most time on, and that's just trying to get agencies to work together. So this is the one that I worked on, National Strategic Plan for Advanced Manufacturing. So as I mentioned, we had the various departments work together, and at least not working at cross purposes, but hopefully actually working towards a common goal. That's the objective there. So those are my 4 ideas: saying no to bad ideas, serving as an early warning system and a policy entrepreneur, helping to respond to crisis and also to assure the public that there is an effective response, and then lastly, improving policy implementation. And so that's what I walked away from the year in the White House learning. And as I said, I had a chance to go over and talk about it with the folks in the office. They seem positive, and you never know. And I'm happy to talk about any of this or any of the other subjects that Professor Park mentioned. So thanks for your attention.
Okay, now floor is open. Any questions?
Okay.
Thank you for your interesting story. I have a question about the people in the White House. I think in my imagination, the people in the White House are outside of OSTP. People in the White House is kind of layperson about science and technology. Then, as an officer, is there any good strategy to persuade those officers to express your idea about science and technology to a layperson?
Yeah, so I think this goes back to the main title of the talk. I think the goal of the science advisor in the office needs to be advancing the president's agenda. So if you want to get the economic advisor to work with you, or you want to get the security advisor to work with you, you need to show that what you're arguing for is going to advance their goals. So I think the key is connecting into their interests and showing how what you want to do fits with what they want to do as well. So that's why I think about science and technology as a means to an end. So there's lots of things that are means, right? You can spend money, you can change institutions, and so we should think of science and technology as another, in a sense, another tool in the toolkit to achieve a goal. Like if your goal is environmental protection, right? Some piece of that might be regulation, some piece of that might be changing behavior, but some piece of that might be new technologies to replace old technologies. And so for the person who's the environmental advisor, you want to say, hey, this should be part of your toolkit. And here's how, and here's the various resources we have as a country or as a government or as an agency that will help you do that. And so that's, I think, the key thing. But it is true, almost everybody else in the White House is a lawyer or a political consultant or an administrator of some kind. And there's an education process that has to go along, and persuasion. And I think one of the problems that some people from the technical community have is they think that their argument is self-evident. Like, just because I say it must be true, or just because I have this graph, it must be true. But for people coming with a non-technical background, you have to speak in their language. You have to bring them along and convince them that you know what you're talking about. Because as we said, a lot of crazy ideas come out of science too.
Thank you for your presentation. I have 4 quick questions.
Okay.
You showed us about the U.S. public has the science.
Yeah.
But during before after the economic crisis, there's a kind of criticism about why government spends so much money to basically science. Why not spending money for the kind of fixing the economic problems?
I'm going to write these down. You're going to give me all 4. So
Okay. That's first question. My second question is about when I attended the AAS conference in Northern Virginia, in DC, there was an interesting debate about, U.S., we don't have any kind of control tower of science technology policy. Look at China, look at South Korea, they have control tower, whereas we have very small OSTP.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of, not consensus, but kind of very favorable opinions about U.S. need to do something to create some kind of big size kind of agency, more like capital level kind of agency. My third question is about the influence of politics in science and technology policy. You should have briefly mentions about some kind of tension, Congress and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. But at the same time, I think it's very difficult to eradicate this kind of political influence in science and technology policy. But at the same time, there's kind of effort. For example, Jack Marble, former director of the OSTP, he tried to initiate some science policy, saying that we have to make some kind of system. So, and then based on this kind of evidence and kind of scientifically collected data, we can make decision. In that way, we can kind of remove this kind of unjustifiable political influence. So I'm just wondering how much OSTP can have adopted this kind of Jack Marburger's idea.
Okay.
And the last question is for the unprecedented. One of my interesting science technology policy reports I noticed is rising above the gathering storm.
Yeah.
There is a kind of two revisions. Second revision is much more darker kind of color front, which means that the scientists and the researchers said that we have a consensus, we are in trouble.
Yeah.
We have to do, government need to do something to kind of support STEM educations and do something for revitalizing science technologies. Do you think that kind of consensus is working on in OSDP? And one extra question. I'm sorry, he's the one that I really wanted to interview. I really would like to hear from you about a little bit detail about U.S. example, National Network for Manufacturing Innovations. It looks like the Obama government tried to initiate innovation policy by saying reshoring, or that, inviting the companies from outside the country back to the state, using R&D center and put together to revitalize R&D policy. And manufacturing sector is in the core of the innovation movement. I think that's very interesting. So if you have a chance to involve, it looks like you are one of the core members of initiating this initiative.
Yeah.
If I want to hear
so that a lot of really great questions, and be happy to talk with you further, maybe offline as well. So let me see if I can take them in order. So the first one was about whether the government role in science is in crisis after the financial crisis. I think the answer is no. I think we have a general stalemate on our budget, and because R&D is a big enough part of the budget, it's going to be affected by this. But I don't think it's specifically targeted at that. I don't think there is that much skepticism of, and I don't know whether I don't know whether I have more data on this, but I would be very surprised if this graph has changed at all. I mean, I just think the American public is supportive of science, and it thinks it's going to get great stuff from medical research, going to have a longer life, and regardless of whether the facts support that or not, there's a lot of faith. And I don't think that that's changed. The financial crisis, it damaged confidence in banks, but I don't think in science, and I don't think they're associated. Central control. So this is funny because I was just in China, and in fact, I was at a weekend meeting in Shanghai, and the theme of that meeting was coordinated innovation. And the funny thing was this. I guess they do this every year. They have a country that they honor, and this year's country of honor was Russia. So it was like Russia-China cooperation. It's a technology, and I'm the American representative. So I took as my theme uncoordinated innovation, because that is what we do in America. We do uncoordinated innovation, and I don't think we'll ever get a central office. And in fact, I think there are a lot of strengths that come with that. There are weaknesses, so high-speed trains not going anywhere in America, whereas in China and elsewhere they are. But I think an uncoordinated system is very good for some kinds of innovation, and I don't think we have a choice. That's just the way our system is. So I'm skeptical that will move in that direction. Evidence-based science and technology policy. Well, yes and no. So on the one hand, as I replied to the previous question, there's always a political dimension in any policy. I don't think you can get rid of it. I don't think you should get rid of it. We have a system of elections because people have values that they want to achieve. And the president's job is to try to realize those values. And the science advisor's job is to work for the president to achieve those values. That doesn't mean we can't have better choices when there are relatively well-structured policy options, right? So what's the balance between, pushing new technology for pollution control and just regulating existing technology? So I think on those kind of questions, it is really important to have evidence, and our government isn't very good at accepting evidence, but we can keep advancing that. But I think on the big questions, you're just never going to have evidence to resolve them. They're not resolvable by evidence, right? Should we go to war in Iraq? I mean, there was some evidence out there. It wasn't taken into account very well, but in the end, it's a judgment call, and that's true for all the important stuff. Rising above the gathering storm. Well, that's funny. This is a report from the National Academy of Sciences, which sort of said that there's a crisis, but there was very little evidence to support that report. There was a lot of, to my mind, a lot of hysterical statements and not a lot of analysis. There's continuing drumbeat that says, the U.S. is falling behind, it's no longer the leader, no longer competitive. And I think we need to have that debate. I think there are plenty of things that the U.S. can do better. But again, this is one of the points I made over the weekend in Shanghai. We would be foolish to ignore our strength. And sometimes we tend to do that. We get a little bit inward focused, and we forget how the rest of the world sees us. So these capabilities in science and technology, they're very durable. I mean, even a few years of bad budgets isn't going to wipe them out. And so if we're talking about decades and decades of budget cuts, that's one thing. But a few years, I think we can recover. And we need to have this discussion so we can recover. But I don't see us in a crisis the way some of those reports do. And then you're right, I was involved with the National Network for Manufacturing Innovation. That was the most exciting part of my work at the White House. And I think we should maybe have a side conversation about it. But it's interesting to see the U.S. Trying to make a concerted effort in manufacturing. It hasn't been adopted by the Congress, so we're only working within executive authority, which is very limited. And at the moment, there's a bill that the House of Representatives actually passed a bill for this, and now it's sitting in the Senate. So we have an election going on next week. After the election, there'll be another session of the old Congress, and maybe they'll pass it, but I don't know what the odds of that are. But I think until we have real legislative action, we can't do what we need to do in that area. And most of the things going on in manufacturing have to do with other forces, currency fluctuations, the trade policies, and so on. So, but I think this can have an effect in some focused areas. And I think it's maybe a new model we'll see for public and private cooperation, which is a little bit more coordinated than we've done in some other areas. So, okay, am I done? Yeah.
I only have one question, a broad one. Actually picks up on a question he asked. So, because I took his third question to also be about the dilemma of eliminating influence of politics in science and technology. And I'm wondering, you have this nice model and discussion about one model, or a nice discussion of one model of how science and politics can interact, which is in the White House, a very political institution.
Yeah.
You have this advisor, and then in a way, the different roles suggest different ideas then about science, its relationship to politics. Is science inherently has its own politics, its own values? And then that would be the mole model, right? Where it then invades the political institution for its own agenda. Or as you seem to want to argue it, something maybe between where they don't have their own agenda, they're marshaling something else neutral, kind of technical capability in the interest of the political institution. If you take that and compare it to other models, I just wonder whether you could say more about this tension.
Yeah.
Because, and I have two other models in mind. There's the sort of failed experiment I've heard others sort of in STS longingly talk about, which is the Office of Technology Assessment for Congress. Sheila Jasanoff is always talking about it. That's what she wants. She wants to bring that back.
Yeah.
Or you have the National Academy of Sciences, which is a much older, I mean, it was, you mentioned in your article, it was created during the Civil War in a way to be the older model of science. Like, it would be this sort of stand-apart institution.
Yeah.
And I wonder, like, and what you're describing is an institution that's just inherently political.
Yeah. So let me respond to that in a couple ways. So the first thing to say, within the academic literature, the main piece that I was responding to is a book by Roger Pielke called Honest Broker. And he talks about the science advisor as being sort of this neutral arbiter. And so that's why I'm saying he has to be an agent. I mean, I don't think that the science advisor will be taken credibly. And the most important thing that the science advisor needs to achieve is the trust of the president. I mean, the most valuable commodity in the White House is the time of the president. And in order to get that time, you have to go through the chief of staff or some higher authority, and you have to persuade them that you have something to offer the president. So I don't think the honest broker, I'm just, some of you may know that old TV show dragged me, even when I tell this to American audiences, they don't remember, but it was about police detectives, and their motto was just the facts, man. That's all I'm going to say. I'm just going to, so if the science advisor goes to the president, well, I'm going to tell you the facts. That's just not going to get him in the door. There's not going to be an opportunity to be persuasive that way. So I was mainly reacting in terms of the scholarly discussion to that honest broker concept. Other models, so the Office of Technology Assessment, I think it was actually a little bit along the lines of the honest broker model, but it was in a very different setting. So try to do all of Congress, rather than having one boss, you have 535 bosses, and bosses with all kinds of interests, political differences, policy differences, they're from different parts of the country. And so the way the OTA tried to survive was to be very carefully negotiating what it was going to study and what the boundaries were. So, you know, every study had support from the majority party and the minority party, and they're working with this committee and that committee. And so, if you look at how that office functioned, it was actually very constrained in that way, and it never made policy recommendations. It always said, well, you know, here's the picture, and here are some very broad options. But because it had all these different masters, it wasn't in a position to take a strong view. And in fact, when it did, it got into trouble. So the most famous one was the Strategic Defense Initiative report that it put out in 1985, and basically said, this is crazy. This kit just can't work from a technical perspective, and that really angered Republicans and helped contribute to ultimately being killed off. So I think something like OTA might be recreated in a congressional context, but I don't think it can really serve in the presidential context. So I think this question is very much dependent on the way the institutions are organized. National Academy of Sciences, there are different views about how important it is. I think I tend to be a little bit more skeptical of it. It's often a place that people send problems that they want them to just go away for a couple of years. It's like, let's go do a study, so, you know, and then we'll reconsider it later. They're very thoughtful often. They're very slow.
I mean, the reason
but they also are often constrained by circumstances. You know, the academy has to watch its reputation, and so it sometimes has to pull back things that people might want to say now.
The reason I ask is because for people interested in science policy or policies guided by science and technology in the United States on an issue, in the 1990s, OTA was sort of the hallmark of reports for covering issues. I learned about it. I was interested in genetically modified foods.
It was great for academics. I mean, it's still good for academics.
And today, those kinds of reports, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I think they come out of the Office of Management and Budget, which is really peculiar because they publish.
The Congressional Budget Office.
Oh, the Congressional. That's it. Sorry, the Congressional Budget Office. So they publish these reports, and those reports are always through the lens of cost. Which is limiting. And like you say, the NAS publishes these reports, and there's this kind of way in which everyone.
I mean, I guess the other thing to remember about Congress, of course, is every member has a staff, and those staff often have a lot of resources. I mean, there's quite a few PhDs working for the Congress, and so there are, of course, every interest group and association, you know, in the country wants to provide information. So I don't know that there's a shortage of information. There may be a shortage of kind of consensual or consolidated information.
I guess I'm wondering about creating credible information.
Credible information, that's a good word.
And it goes to this problem of an institution that is politicized versus science, which historically and traditionally is thought to not be political.
I mean, but you could take the OTA experience as a test case that something that is trying so hard to be not politicized simply can't survive in a politicized environment. And the environment has gotten a lot more. I mean, it was 1994. This was when the Republicans first took over the Congress after being out for 40 years, and they had a relatively radical agenda from the point of view of sort of this history. And they had to kill something, and they decided to kill OTA. Well, 20 years later, the Republican agenda has gotten a lot more radical. I mean, climate change is almost like a question of religion now, right? If you believe in climate change, or one religion. If you don't believe in climate change, or not. I mean, it sounds crazy, but that is really the dynamics of it. So I think in this environment, it's even more difficult to imagine that such an institution can succeed. We just have, for the moment, diametrically opposed worldviews going on in Washington. It's scary. I mean, I think the rest of the world should be concerned. Now, obviously, I'm an Obama guy, so take what I have to say with a grain of salt. But I think the Republican agenda, especially in energy and environment, is just crazy. And it has nothing to do with science at all.
Thank you for your talk. I'm a master's student at FPT. I have one question. Can we say that it is an entrepreneurial world if he or she is just an agent of a person? And what is your definition of entrepreneur when you say like that? Because I heard that one of the key components to be an entrepreneur is have to be creative an idea.
Yeah.
So in that sense, if he or she is just a mere agent of presence, how can you say it is a entrepreneur?
That's a good question. So let me clarify a little bit. So when I think about agent, right, this is a person who's delegated to achieve the goal. So some of you may have heard of principal-agent theory. You have the principal who's determining the goals, and the agent is the one who's trying to achieve the goals. But often the principal doesn't actually know enough to tell the agent exactly what to do, right? So we say the general, go out and win the war, but exactly where do you put your troops and what kind of troops do you need? That's up to the general. So similarly here, I think the question is, the science advisor should know what the goals of the president are, whether it's environmental protection or national security or whatever. And then, as an agent, they need to come up with ideas to help achieve those goals. But in order to do that, they have to have allies. They have to have other resources besides. And this is a small office, and it has some ability to be persuasive. But really, all the money and all the people are out in the executive agencies or they're in Congress. So the entrepreneurial task is to pull together the packages of resources that other powerful actors will support. So we think about a private entrepreneur, they're taking risk and they're putting together resources towards a goal, and that's the way I'm thinking about public entrepreneur.
Maybe I'm asking you for a judgment call here.
That's okay.
You showed us the list of all the OSTP head, and you mentioned like a lot of them are hard sciences.
Yeah.
And as a policy person, do you believe who would be more adequate for the advisor?
Yeah. So I wouldn't want to say that all hard scientists are bad people or good people. And in fact, I actually think you have to be from that community to be a credible spokesman for it and to have that office. So I can imagine, and actually there are a couple of examples of people from life sciences. I don't think someone from social sciences, even though Killian was, as I mentioned, not a PhD, he was the president of MIT, so that may be a special case. But I think in order to have that public symbolism, you need to have this background. And I think what is kind of a qualifying characteristic is that usually these people have run something already. They ran a lab, big lab, they ran a university, so they have administrative experience. And in that kind of a setting, you get political experience. You're fighting for your budget, you're dealing with legislature, you're being called to Washington to serve on National Academy studies, so you get some experience. Now, some people would argue that Jack Gibbons was very effective because he had been working with Congress for a long time. And that's very unusual, actually. He's a little bit different than some of these others. But I think in the end, it's that connection that you have with the boss that really counts. And, that is hard to judge from the outside, but you hear various things.
There's something kind of related to this question, so I remember you had a slide that mentioned several projects that were rejected by the president, but was defended were shot down by the president. This one.
Yeah.
So coming from a creative perspective of the government, between the principal agent model, the president actually hires or chooses the advisor as his side, right?
Mm-hmm.
So basically, they're on both sides, on the same side.
Same side.
But
Yeah.
how can this something like this would happen if the person who is chosen as an advisor has quite similar views? Would be expected to have similar views as a president? I mean, would that come from a truly a neutral scientist perspective? So the president, although I'm on your side, I cannot agree with you because I'm a scientist.
Well, that's exactly what happens in some of these cases. I mean, it comes back to the earlier question. In some cases, the president says, even the science advisor says, you may think you know what you're doing, you may think this is going to advance your goals, but actually, you're going to spend a lot of money and it's not going to succeed, or it's going to stir up more opposition than it should. And sometimes the president goes along with that, and sometimes he doesn't. So, the White House is full of conflicts, even though everybody is, in the big picture, we're all on the same side. We're all fighting over resources and try to get our priorities achieved, and my project is more important than yours. So there's always going to be that tension within any White House, and the science advisor needs to decide where he stands on some issues. So something like Apollo or Strategic Defense Initiative, these are huge, multi-billion-dollar, tens of billions of dollars, many years projects, and the president has to make up his mind. Is he going to be for it or against it? And the science advisor, I think, has a responsibility in those cases to decide as well. What's the balance, right? What's the trade-off between whatever political or other goals the president might be trying to achieve and whatever the risks might be on the science and technology side? And you're still guessing. I mean, you may have a certain amount of evidence. Can we go to the moon for a certain price or not? In 1960, there's still a lot of guesswork. It may be evidence-based, but there's going to be still a lot of judgment.
Hi. Thank you for your talk, Professor Hart. My question is about the advanced manufacturing policy you have been engaging in. It was kind of natural that industrialized countries gave their manufacturing industries to the developing countries. And correct me if I'm wrong, but as my understanding, the basic idea of your proposal was that bring the manufacturing industry to the USA because of the big trade deficit. So even though advanced manufacturing is more like high-tech manufacturing industries, but have you heard about any response, or do you know how, like, your major trading partner like China, how they like your idea and the policies?
Yeah. So I mean, it's an interesting question. I did hear a little bit about this in China, and there's concern that certain kinds of manufacturing that had been labor intensive, might be replaced by more automated. So 3D printing is one, and actually we went to an exhibition center in Beijing, and they showed us all the work that the Chinese are doing in 3D printing. So I think it's taken seriously. I guess I would be careful not to exaggerate. I'm just going to draw a little graph here. I have another presentation on this subject, but if you look at the U.S. Share of the workforce in manufacturing, and this is I think it peaked in about 1953, and there was sort of a steady decline of about 0.5% per year. But around 2000, it went down like that. It went down really sharply. So, for me, the goal is try to get us back up to the old declining trend. Don't tell my colleagues at the White House. But we had a real crisis in the period from 2000 to 2010 in manufacturing, and so I think I don't think we're going to rebuild manufacturing as the center of our economy again. I don't think that's the way the world works. We're going to still have 80 or 90% of our jobs and services, but it's very important for trade, and I think hopefully we can recover some of this lost ground. I think there probably are some areas where the balance will get shifted, and it should get shifted. I mean, most of this is China. I mean, really, right? that's what's going on. In 2000, right? China joined the WTO, and the U.S. more or less went along with it. I mean, there are a lot of other things going on in the U.S. domestic economy, and a lot of this doesn't have to do so much with the industry itself, but with economic factors like currency values and so on. But there could be some sectors that get transformed, and I guess I see that as a natural part of economic development. There are new ways of making fabrics that put people who had been growing crops for fabrics out of work. I don't know that this is going to dramatically change that. The biggest story, even bigger than what the administration is doing, the big story in American manufacturing is shale gas. The price of gas has just come so far down. And so that's one effect, is that as input, the prices come way down. But then also there's just a huge amount of purchasing that activity is doing in the United States. So I went to northern Pennsylvania, which is a big area for gas drilling, and there's just trucks and trucks full of pipes going down the street. So all those pipes have to be built. All that equipment is being built. So that by itself is driving manufacturing in the U.S. So the administration was kind of lucky in that regard. Now, of course, it also had the auto industry, which was in complete collapse when it came in. And I think it should get credit for saving the American auto industry, which wasn't necessarily a sure thing. So this is only one part of a kind of a bigger picture that's going on.
Is OSTP involved in budgeting process?
It is. And in fact, if you're interested, you can find online. Every year, the OMB and the OSTP put out a memo, and it says here are the priorities for the president's budget. And then, in most cases, when agencies come, so there's this complicated process. In fact, I read somewhere there's 170 separate steps to go from the first stage of the budget process to the end. But while the president, so the biggest point in the budget development is the president puts forward a budget, and then it goes to Congress. So while the president's budget is being put together, there's a series of meetings between the White House and the agencies. And OSTP is often in those meetings. And ultimately, the very big issues get resolved between the director of OMB, the director of OSTP, and the head of the agency. So there is some involvement, and it's an important part of what it does.
So usually OMB has a bigger hands then?
Oh yeah, OMB is the kind of engine room of the White House. But OSTP can play an important role, and in the best of circumstances, they're working together. And that was my point in my earlier paper on OSTP back in the administration.
Usually, when you're talking about science policy, hobby groups, two categories: political science and science and policy.
Yeah.
And if we apply that category to OSTP, is it working in one category or two categories, or how can you characterize using?
Yeah, I think it's doing both. And it depends on the issue. So it's certainly dealing in the budget process with resources, and it's also dealing in many cases with the regulation of science. So for better or worse, Holdren got dragged into the question of scientific integrity, and there's been a lot of regulations dealing with scientific integrity that came out. So that would be kind of the policy for science. But then also, in an area like manufacturing or energy, it's dealing with the evidence underlying the program as well. So I think it does both.
Almost about time, but if you have any burning question, I would take. Okay, it's almost.
I think I've exhausted everything.
Well, let's give our warmest thanks to the advertisement on this Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. Professor Yun Jung Lee is organizing undergraduate program, undergraduate event. The 건축을 걷다, and then you can see the it's a special event so that you can take advantage of it. And Thursday we have a regular colloquium, but remember this is the time of humanities forum, which is happening in Daejeon, and for example Peter Garrison of Harvard is coming, and Chang Lee of Princeton University is coming, and so it's the big things are coming here. We also take advantage of it. And then on Friday there is a History of Science annual conference taking place in Southern University. So thank you very much.